Hi, Garrett. Lovely to have you. So grateful. Thank you so much for your time. I've been meaning to have you. You know this very well. And yeah, we are finally here. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really good to see you, Dr. Scruffy, and it's a pleasure to be on your show today. So thank you for inviting me, and let's hope we can have a good exchange of debate and discussion and learn something together, and hopefully your listeners can learn something too. And uh, and from this, hopefully too, if they hear and see things that they agree with or disagree with, that they can comment in the comment section and say, "Listen, you've seen this from the wrong position, the right position." I love to be challenged like that. So this is really good, a good space for us.
I love that. And definitely they are going to comment. You will see. And I'm going to forward you some of the comments that they make. I don't know, for some reason, my listeners prefer inboxing me privately. Probably because I have that email, direct contact via email option. But
Perfect.
then again, I'm happy because referred to me as Dr. Scruffy. I often correct people. It's not Scruffy. My sister actually frowns when somebody calls me Scruffy because she named me Scruffy. It comes from
Scruffy.
the, it's Scruffy. It comes from the word Scruffy because of my scruffy looks. But then she has this thing of reading words in isiZulu. English
Yes.
words would be read in our native language. And
Yes.
so she read Scruffy as Scruffy. So I became Scruffy to her.
You became Scruffy, and interestingly enough, this is the first time I've called you Scruffy. It's normally Q, and I've always known you as Q. So can I stick with Q? And it kind of reminds me of 007, Q and M and 007. So we'll
I'm,
be
I'm, always,
spy
I'm,
masters.
I'm always
Very good.
reminded of whenever I introduce myself as Q, they'd be like, oh, Q from James Bond?
That's right. That's right. The next James Bond.
Yeah. So this isn't, as you know, Gareth, and as I mentioned offline, it's all about mental health. And you've been in the space for, I think, for as long as you can remember as well.
Yeah, over
And
20 years. Yeah,
yes,
20.
20 years. Wow. I don't think I was born in 20 years, 20 years ago.
Thank you for reminding me.
Well,
Rub the salt in.
so I've stood here, had conversations with a number of people, academics, people that are focusing on mental health issues in correctional services, in academia, and there's quite a number of themes that have came up during our conversations. But our conversation is going to be structured a bit differently. I want to
Okay.
focus on emotions. I want to focus on relationships. I want to focus on other things that I haven't spoken about previously. And, oftentimes we talk about stress, we talk about anxiety, we talk about depression. And I believe that all these are linked to emotions. Yes, do you agree?
I do, yes, I do.
Okay. How do you then describe an emotion? What is an emotion and how do they work?
So an emotion is a response to the environment, first and foremost. So it's an internal response. And if we look at humanity across the world, so across culture, across ages, across cultures, there are sets of emotions that are consistent around the world. There's happiness, there's sadness, there's anger, there's the feelings of betrayal, there's joyfulness, and there's bitterness. There's a long list of emotions that impact every person on the planet at some stage or another. And what I found as I've got my PA joining me, by the way. His name's Timmy. He's a cat. My cat is joining me, so he might just pop into the screen, take over. So to go back to your question around emotions, emotions are a behavioral response to the environment. And if we look back at childhood, we're told don't be naughty. be happy. You know, if someone is feeling upset, we say, don't be upset. If someone's being angry, we say, don't be angry. If someone is feeling depressed, we say, look at the bright side. So what we're effectively doing is we are minimizing the emotions, the natural emotions that people have at that time, rather than allowing them to process those emotions. So rather than say to someone who has suffered the loss of a partner or a loss of money, a loss of a job, and say, don't worry, things will be better. All we have to do is sit and be present with them. That's all. We give advice when we're asked for advice. We don't give advice for the sake of giving advice. So for me, as I've grown and developed, I've realized that emotions that I felt as a child, which included feelings of anger, abandonment issues, those emotions, as I grew up, and I'm now 45, I've realized that those emotions like anger, betrayal, hatred was actually sadness and feelings of loss and feelings of grief. And by being able to rename them has given me a sense of power because I can now name them. And when I'm with a client, a coaching client, whether it be an individual or a group, we can actually start to drill down at those emotions and look at the emotions and name it. Because in the words of Danziger wrote a book called Naming the Mind. And he said, if we can't name it, we can't own it. So we get people who get frustrated. They'll say, Gareth, this person's really triggering me. Why do they trigger me? How do I stop them from triggering me? How do I stop them from triggering this emotion? The question shouldn't be, how do I stop them? But rather, how do I manage my emotions? How do I unhook myself from the triggers that people trigger me with? And that's my responsibility as an adult to do that. It's not your responsibility. So going back to the emotions side of things, hopefully I've answered in part. It's a very, very broad topic. So it's one that can take us 50 hours just to get this through the surface. I'm giving you a snapshot around emotions being something that are natural and normal, and feeling anger, feeling betrayal, feeling happiness, feeling elation, feeling compassion, kindness. These are all healthy emotions, including anger. So this notion that anger, we mustn't be angry, we mustn't be sad, these are negative comments to natural behaviors and natural responses. Where emotions do become unhealthy to us and others is where we lash out to the point of hurting others and hurting ourselves. That's where we start to move into the space of unhealthy emotional regulation, or what we call emotional dysregulation. The emotions are dysregulated. We're not in control. And that's when people have a feeling of being out of control. And things like drinking too much, drinking in excess, um, being in a toxic space, having family or friends who belittle us, being triggered by environments, these lead to us lashing out. And that's generally what gets us into trouble. So as adults, we've got to own this. We've got to own our triggers. We've got to own our behaviors. It's easy to pass them on to someone else and say, well, I drink because of my spouse. I I smoke weed because of my boss. My boss makes me so stressed. But what we are actually saying is, I'm abrogating responsibility and I'm handing over all of my power to someone else. And I don't think anyone on the planet has the right to take our power away from us. So we've got to control these emotions. So hopefully that can impart some tiny sliver of info in assisting you with answering that.
And tell me, what then happens if we suppress those emotions? Because many a times, we say, for instance, we want to cry, but then I speak on behalf of men, and referencing one of the previous conversations I've had. Men are taught that you are actually not supposed to be an emotive person. Don't express your emotions. Don't cry. A man doesn't cry. What then happens when we suppress our emotions?
Well, what you're describing now is something that I encounter with men on a daily basis, and it's an age thing. And I think if I go back to the era of my parents, so my dad today, who's passed away, would be in his 80s. He came from an era of boys don't cry, and when I grew up and I cried, like that was like a no, you don't cry. Not that he ever overtly said do not cry. It was the assumption that boys don't cry because crying is an emotional thing or emotional response that's limited to girls. And for me, there was a dichotomy in that I had so much emotion around everything. I was an emotional child. Now being told to suppress these emotions made no sense to me. And if so if we go back in time, we go back 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, the notion of going to a psychologist or psychiatrist or medical doctor for treatment for depression, for burnout, for anxiety, especially for a man, was unheard of. We knew of mental health facilities as places which were for crazy people, rather than a place that one could go to safely um, get better after burnout, deal better with managing depression and anxiety. So this notion of suppression. So if we look at the psychologist Carl Jung, he came up with the notion of shadow work. So ultimately, what we do in psychology with adults is just what you've described now around suppression of emotion. So let's use this as an example. As a child, as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, you love music and you're a young boy and you've got a family, you go to a school where rugby and soccer are really important and you need to be able to play these but you don't want to, you're not a sporting person. You just like, you don't know a rugby ball from a cricket ball and your hand-eye coordination is not where that of your peers is, and you have a passion for music, you have a passion for singing, you have a passion for the arts, and you're now told that the things that you like to do, the things that you want to do, you have to kind of push them one side to do what society expects of you. Or we get told as children need to be seen and not heard, which means we need to suppress what we want to say. We need to suppress what we want to feel or what we feel. So as a result, we grow up with these mind maps. And bearing in mind as children, the only mind maps that we have to reference on is that of our parents and caregivers and those around us, our adults. So we don't know any better, So what happens then is, as we get older and older, we enter into our 20s, we get into relationships that are dysfunctional because we're not able to integrate that shadow work that Carl Jung talks about, the shadow work being the parts of ourselves that we suppressed in our younger years and even suppressed in our 20s. So we end up with these explosive tantrums, these triggers, being triggered by people, being triggered by, say, for example, you're a child who wanted to play music, you wanted to play the piano and you couldn't, or you wanted to sing and you couldn't. And you then see someone your age, a peer, a colleague or friend at university playing the piano, and they just triggered the hell out of you because it's like, how did they have that opportunity and that was taken away from me? So what's happened is that suppression that we had started to come out in a negative way. Rather than embracing this other student with their gifts, we see them as a threat. We see them as the personal people that have something that was taken away from us. And so to talk about the suppression of emotion is around also the suppression of opportunity that we had. and this saying, well, it's so unfair, life is so unfair, why did this happen to them, but why didn't it happen to me? And generally what happens in when we do have a breakdown or a burnout in our 20s, 30s, 40s, part of the role of the therapist or coach or psychiatrist is to help you look at that element of childhood and within yourself, childhood, teens, and to start to bring to the surface all of those emotions and all of those thoughts and feelings that were suppressed as a child and start to bring them in. So when we bring them in, they don't replace what's currently there. Healthily, they integrate with what is there. And that's what we call integration work, being able to integrate. So we've heard of the term yin and yang. We integrate the yin and the yang together. That emotional response from childhood that was suppressed is now integrated into becoming a fully functioning adult, that we take ownership. And not everyone gets there, and that's okay. And you know, we believe we've got certain milestones we've got to hit. You know, society says at 25 you've got to have had a child. At this age you need to have done this, and at this age you've got to have done this. These rules are nonsense. They are absolutely ridiculous, and they manipulate us in a way that takes us away from our true path. Some of us aren't destined to have kids. Some of us don't want to have kids. Some of us don't want to get married. Some of us want a polygamous relationship that's frowned upon within our cultural group. So we end up with suppressing these emotions because we can't act out our feelings and we can't share them without being criticized. So it's complex. So hopefully that I've just shared a little bit with you. If you'd like me to expand on any part, I can do that with pleasure. Hugh.
Definitely. Interesting that you would mention all those timelines and you make examples. I was thinking actually, not so long ago, that, oh, shucks, I'm actually approaching my 30s and I'm not married. I had told myself that at the age of 28, I'm getting married. So
Yeah.
I then said to myself, definitely by the age 30, I should I should be married. And
Yeah.
here you are saying that that's ridiculous, setting such
Mm.
setting such standards for ourselves. And I think it's society in a way that sets them, even though they don't say it out loud. But then again, you find families saying that, look, actually, speaking from experience, I've been set down and I've been told, so you've done quite a number of things, which is all good and well, but we don't see a Makoti at home. Um, it's time for you to start thinking about uh, starting a family. It's time for you to start thinking about building. That's an investment towards your future, and nothing could be greater than that. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
My thoughts, you know, when it comes to community, you know, I'm even as a white European, having been born in South Africa with parents born here, whose parents were born here and whose parents were born here for many generations. Um, you know, we can poo-poo and um, we can push aside the cultural, the social elements of what our family and friends in our communities at home say to us about marriage, and also the self pressures that we put on ourselves relating to getting married and having 2.5 kids, or let's round it up, 3 kids, and you know, a house and a garden and a car and all of these things. You know, if we look at what the primary nucleus is in psychology and in sociology, the primary nucleus is the family.
Yeah.
So by nature, from the beginning of time, the beginning of recorded time, the family structure has been part and parcel of societal structure from the beginning of time. So to have gogos and uncles and parents ask us, when are you going to have a child? When are you going to settle down? When are you going to get married? These are sometimes said in a way to coerce us into doing those things, even when we're not ready. But I think a lot of the time it comes from a good place in terms of what legacy are you leaving behind when you do get to your older years. Are you, is there the potential for you to be lonely by not having had kids or having a spouse? And these are real questions because, you know, if your parents never got married or never had children, you wouldn't be here. And QED, we'd end up with no more people being born and the world would come to an end. So that from an evolutionary perspective, the notion of reproduction is fundamental across every species. So to reproduce is a natural function of not only humans, but of animals and of even plants to reproduce and make sure that their lineage continues. So I think when we look at it, we need to look at it through the lens of evolution and say, listen, the need to have to proliferate, to have children, to have offspring. This is an important part of society's growth to ensure the continuation of the species. Having said that, personally, is that the world is at over 7 billion people, I think approaching 8 billion at the moment. And I think what happens is we end up with people who get married, have kids for the wrong reasons. They get married and have kids because it's a tick box exercise. It's the same as saying, well, I always need to have food in the fridge, or I need to have a nest egg, or I need to do certain ritualistic things at home when XYZ happens. So there's this internal and external pressure to perform and to do these certain ritualistic things. And for me, I come from the school of thought in 2024 that if we are to get married, if we are to enter into a relationship, and if we are to have children, the decision needs to be ours as adults. The community have a right to speak and to say, Q, why have you not?
Mm.
We can't stop people from asking questions and entering our space. But we do have a responsibility to boundary set. And we kind of feel we have to justify why we're not married or why we haven't had kids. And sometimes it could be physiological. Sometimes there may be an issue relating to reproduction, the woman not being able to produce eggs, and as a result, not being able to fall pregnant, or the man being infertile. Or there may be the element of the LGBTQIA, where there's not a desire to marry or partner with someone of the opposite sex. So there's so many dynamics that come into play, even financial ones, where one says, I actually don't have the money to be in a relationship and have children and do all these things. And many of my clients fall into that category where they say, we just can't afford to have kids. And if we do, we want them to have the best quality education that we can give them, the best life that we can. And I know many couples who only get married in their 30s, mid 30s, and then start to have kids in their later 30s. I know some who don't have kids. I know some who have gotten married out of the pressure and necessity to be married at a certain age. They've had kids, and then by late 30s, they are divorced. And then the community then look and shun them for saying, how can you get divorced? You must stick with your partner, not knowing that the relationship has come to an end. It's dissolved. There's no love. There's no passion. Each one has gone in their own direction. So we then say, well, okay, so I'm going to stick it out with this person. We don't love each other. We don't care for each other. I'm in a relationship with someone else, and she's in a relationship with someone else. And are we living this life for others, community, for keeping up appearances, as in the name of an old British series we've called Keeping Up Appearances? Are we doing this? Are we going to church on a Sunday, getting dressed up in our shiny black shoes to show that we go to church on a Sunday and that we're good people? Or do we live an authentic life that is true to us. Our life doesn't have to make sense to anyone, and it shouldn't. Our life only has to make sense to us. And if we're deliberate and intentional and direct in terms of what we want and the direction that we're going in, we'll be just fine, whether we have kids or not. So the role of the family and the community in asking questions, I think, generally comes from a good place. And I think if we are at a phase in our life where marriage and kids and settling down is not in that, then we as the adult male or female need to own our triggers to that environment rather than lash out and shout at them for asking those questions, because it's a question that people ask. And but if it comes down to boundaries where they start to apply pressure on you and start to go into your boundary space, you have a responsibility to protect your boundaries and to reset your boundaries. And that can be done without shouting, without emotion. It can be done with kindness, with care, with logic, with love, where we start by saying, I can see you really care about me. You really care about my future, and I really value that. Having said that, I'm not ready for settling down. I'm not ready for doing these things. I have other things in mind right now for me that put me first and put my dreams and aspirations first. And there's nothing selfish about that. What's selfish is following the status quo and doing something because others have put so much pressure on us that we do it. And what we find is, if you can imagine us with a car, our car has now broken down. So we've got a car, we're in the middle of the road, and there's a family or community behind us pushing that car to move, and we're in the driver's seat. What happens when they stop pushing? The car stops. The drive of the car has to be internal. It has to come from you. So until you can drive it, the community can push as much as they want. When they stop pushing, it slows down and comes to a grinding halt. So we've got to find that internal drive. And that can take people 50 years, 80 years, 100 years. But what I am finding with the younger generation are waking up a lot faster than my generation. They are self-expressing and self-identifying at younger ages and saying, actually, no, I don't want that. I don't want a relationship with XYZ. I don't want to follow in the footsteps of my parent who was a teacher and whose parent was a teacher. I actually want to do something else. I want to be a ballet dancer. I want to be a builder. And when they have that capacity and strength to say that and do that and action it, they may get resistance from family and community, but ultimately, when family and friends see that this person is happy doing what they're doing, then there should be support of that person in what they're doing. So it ties back to the emotional side of things again. We're not responsible for the emotions of others, but we are responsible for how we treat others. And if we go back to Ubuntu, everything we do, everything we say needs to be grounded in dignity. So although someone may not show us dignity or may have been cruel or nasty to us, they still have the right to dignity. And by us stripping away that dignity makes us no better than them. Yeah. So for me, this is a really, really interesting question that you've raised. So in a roundabout way, I hope I've answered it in part. It's one of those questions, again, that can take 20 books to write because there's so many angles to write from and so many cultural dynamics to take into place.
Definitely.
Yeah, so there we go.
And that's what I wanted to come to, actually. We come from different backgrounds, and sometimes the parents that we have, I'm going to mainly focus on family. The families that we have a great influence on our decision making. And I know there's still a lot of people out there who struggle to make their own decisions because of the families from which they come. At a certain age of 21, start thinking about marriage, start thinking about building. You say that that should be one's own decision, and you should nicely communicate that to your loved ones. But you do find what do you call them? Your stubborn fathers. It's usually the male figures and your aunts
Yes.
from
Yes.
the father's side
Mm.
that are usually in agricultural extension, we refer to them as laggards. They
Yes.
are laggards. So how do you then do all the things that you mentioned when you are dealing with such people? And these are people, they are not late adopters. They are just laggards. When they have their minds fixated on something, they don't deviate from that.
Well, I would start by asking them why such critical interest in your growth? How
Let's
does
role play.
your yes, how
Let's role
does
play. You
sorry?
asked me that. Let us role play this. You asked me that question, and I'm the older aunt, and I'm gonna tell you, in the presence of all these other misogynistic figures, uh, I don't answer to you. You listen to me.
Yes.
So
So
how do you respond to that? Because that's the closest you would ever get from such people.
100%, and we need to remember too, in many cultures, and in many African cultures, and in many Asian cultures, age is a major determining factor in terms of hierarchy. So we have a saying: we respect our elders.
Yeah.
Do we respect them whether they're right or wrong? So if an elder says to us 5 + 5 is 9, and we know that it's 10, do we still toe the line and say, okay, I believe it's 9 and I'm going to stick with 9, even though I know that the answer is 10? Or am I gentle enough in challenging them in a way that challenges their thinking? I don't believe anyone's ever too old to learn. So there's this adage that I learned in law school back in 1998 to 2000 when I was at Rhodes. I was doing law as part of my degrees. Was the adage was learn, unlearn, and relearn.
Yeah.
So the notion of learning top down and being told top down is authoritarian. It's dictatorial. So it's we are up here and you are down here. And if we look at humanity as a collection of people, my belief is that as human beings, we are all equal. So regardless of age, regardless of status, regardless of how many zeros we have in our bank, whether 0,00 is our balance or 1,000,000,000 is our balance, our monetary value doesn't determine our value, and neither does our age. So by all means, just as an older aunt or an older uncle has a right to speak to you and to ask questions and to direct questions at you, so too do you have the right to answer them or not answer them. So when we hand our power over to them, we're essentially doing what is called having an external locus of control. So the external locus is the same notion of being 11 years old and one of our caregivers waking us up to get ready for school. They'll say, Q, are you getting up? It's school time. Q, are you getting up? As we get to 18, 19, we move out, possibly we have to set our own alarms. So we've got to manage our own direction. And if we're late, if we don't get up when the alarm says so, we're late for work and there's repercussions. So to go back to the notion or the question you had around your aunt figures, I kind of feel as though we're in a state of being cornered by a pack of wolves. So essentially the aunts being the pack of wolves, and I mean this in the gentlest sense, not in the vicious wolves attacking. I honestly believe that in the majority of cases, the questions that come from our elders, they come from a very good place. I don't think they come from a negative place. I think they come from a pro-social place. And if I look at how African culture has developed in Ubuntu, I think the West has a lot to learn from these integrated cultural practices of it takes a village to raise a child. The West is too individualistic. It's too dog eat dog. I'll stand on you to get where I need to get to. In Ubuntu, it is if someone's on the ground or someone's hungry, we feed them. If someone needs to be uplifted, we pick them up. And I think so. I look at your question with the aunts and the circle of aunts and elders, not as the not so much the pack of wolves in the negative sense, but rather a group of individuals who care for you. So we make the assumption that that what they're asking and saying is coming from a caring place. They've naturally seen you grow up. They've seen your potential. They've seen your growth milestones that you have. So Piaget talks about growth milestones, the developing adult from the different stages of suckling to crawling to walking to running to doing all these different things. And I think from their side, when they say, "When are you getting married? It's time to get married," I think it's a question that is, and more than likely has had been asked to them at their age, and they've kind of towed the line and got married. And now they see an adult male in front of them who is self-directed in his thinking. He learns, unlearns, and relearns. So when we say he, we mean Q. So I'll use you as an example. You did your undergraduate degrees, you studied further, you did your master's, your PhD, and ideas and narratives and thoughts that were embedded in you, that were concretized in you at a young age. As you get older, you realize, say, wait a second, these mind maps that I had, these perceptions, they weren't entirely correct, but they weren't entirely incorrect. They may just need to be re-looked at through a different set of lenses. So we were talking about glasses earlier. So, they need to be looked at through a different lens. And if we have the ability to change our view, we have the ability to grow and learn. And I think that even our elders have the ability to grow and learn from us. So the learning is not one directional, top down, but should be unidirectional, up, down, left and right. So we call that vertical and horizontal leadership. So you can lead upwards in your community by teaching them that the lifestyle that you live and that the timelines that you set for yourself are healthy timelines. Just as you respect them and the journeys they took, they too should respect you and the journeys that you take. So it's a two-way street, but your response as opposed to reaction, your reaction is something that is knee-jerk, where you come back with a trigger. Your response is calculated, it's thoughtful, is to say, thank you, I sincerely appreciate that you care about my well-being and the need for me to procreate, the need for me to settle down with someone. It's just at this stage, I don't have someone and my career and my focus is elsewhere. It doesn't mean that that's off the table for the future. We also need to be reminded that we don't need another person in our life to be complete. We are complete on our own. And the dangers of meeting someone to complete us, we hear friends say, she completes me. I cringe because I'm saying, oh my God, what if you get separated at some stage? You're now incomplete. In order to be a healthy partner in a relationship, you yourself need to be complete. You yourself need to know what your values are, what you stand for. And many don't. So many get corralled into marriage, into having kids, purely out of I use the word manipulation in a gentle way, out of the coercion or persuasion of those around us. Not taking into account our personal desires to do things and follow a certain path. So it's a two-way street. So it's hearing them and saying, I hear you, actively listening, 2 ears, 1 mouth, So we speak less, hear more, and recognizing them. So for me, if someone asks me a question and I immediately say no, no is a barrier. Oof, there's the barrier. But if I say, my goodness, Babawa, you've made a really, really good point. I'm gonna take it to heart. I want to think about it. Thank you. I need some space. You know that my trajectory, my path is going in this direction, but I appreciate your wisdom and I appreciate your love and care for me. Let me apply my mind to it. And so what you're doing is the soul in you that is greeting the soul in them, as we say namaste in Eastern cultures. We are acknowledging them. We're not throwing them away. We're not rejecting them. But we're saying, I hear you. However, this is me as an adult following my path. My path doesn't have to make sense to you. Am I pro-social? Am I someone who's contributing to knitting the world together and making it better? Yes. Am I someone who's antisocial? Am I corrupt? Am I dishonest? Am I someone who tears down the fabric of society? That's antisocial. Am I that? No. Thank God. Because if we have too many antisocial people, society collapses. And we end up with no Zulu culture. We end up with no Xhosa culture. We end up with no Nguni cultures. We end up with no European cultures. This is not good. We need pro-social people. And pro-social people who build society up can be single, they can be married, they can be polygamous, they can have no kids up to the age of 100. It's fine. The world has space for everyone in it, my opinion.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks so much. May I please just I know this adds no value to our conversation, maybe slightly, but you keep referring to yourself as a white British man. Why?
Well, it's an interesting thing. So I predominantly, I've grown up here, and when in South Africa, so I was born and bred in Cape Town. And when I say born and bred, back to the whole thing of, um,
Mm.
the continuation of the species. And it's an East London thing. So when I Bolt or Uber and I have a Bolt driver, they'll say to me, "Where are you from?" And it'll be just a general discussion, and I'll say, "Well, Beacon Bay." And I'll say, "Where are you from?" And the driver will say, "Oh, I come from Harare or Bulawayo or Kitwe, you know, maybe KZN." And then the driver will say, "But where are you really from?" And
Mm.
I'll say, "Cape Town." And they'll say, "No, but before that." I said, "No, I wasn't anywhere before that. I've always been in Cape Town." So it's one of those things that is a cultural nuance that I've come um, to, it's a part of my weekly life in terms of my accent, having had the opportunity to travel the world and meet people, being asked where you're from, and the identification of where I come from is, it's not so much important for me, but I find it's important for many people as part of their own heritage, being able to say, "I come from this area," or "I come from the Gegebe clan in Umtanduli," or "I come from the Chesis in Coffee Bay," and it's having that lineage and the grounding. And I think for us in Africa, knowing where we come from, it's the same as asking us what our clan is. There's
Mm.
no there's no hidden agenda in sharing where we come from. There's no
Yeah.
sinister reason. So for me, it's a point of clarity, but more importantly, connectedness. And a very good friend of mine, I was going to say, not a very wise, she is very wise. She's 10 years my senior, but she's always been more wise than I have been. She's my mentor. She will say to me, she's multicultural. So she'll say to me, she engages people at the humanity level.
Mm.
And I say to her, what do you mean? And she'd say, well, strip away the culture, strip away the color, strip away the race, strip away the LGBTQIA plus labeling, strip away the academics, the pedigree, the social class. She said, we are all human beings.
Yeah.
And she said, first and foremost, and everything kind of layers and builds upon that. And so, to answer your question, people will say to me, and when I say people, I mean people in the broadest sense around the world. I've got clients all over the world. They'll say to me, I don't see color, I don't see race. And I understand the import of what they're saying. What they're saying is, I am not racist, or I am a person who is multicultural with friends from all ethnicities, backgrounds, races, religions. For me, when I describe myself as white British, it's not done in any other way other than to identify with a group of people where my heritage comes from. So for me, and in Africa, our heritage is really important to us. In European culture, in Western culture, they're more important, they're more focused on the future. So it's more future focused. Where are we going to be? In Africa, it's our ancestry. So it's our ancestors. So as a white male living in South Africa, I am caught in the middle between my passion and love for and the respect of my ancestors and the ancestors of those in my community, as well as the future centeredness of where we're moving as a society. And I'm kind of caught in the middle between the two. So when people say to me, do you see color? I say, yes, I do. But it's
Mm.
not seen in a racist way. It's seen in a way of embracing the connectedness between who we are, acknowledging the fact that someone comes from Pondoland, acknowledging their heritage, their lineage, the trials and tribulations of their history that brought them to where they are today, why there are slightly culturally different nuances between the Pondos and the Zulus, and how the connectedness and disconnectedness exists. So for me, when I self-describe, it's done in a way of giving dignity to those around me and saying,
Yeah.
I see you as a fellow human being and I respect you where you are and who you are, rather than saying, I don't see your color. Because when I say I don't see your color, it means I don't see you, but I do see you. So for me,
Granted.
the identity is really important in terms of the connectedness between
Mm.
us.
Again, maybe as a follow-up to that, and I'm gonna link that to our conversation. Oftentimes, when we talk about issues of race, you know, we say a black man can never be racist.
Yeah.
And there's quite a number of things that happen between blacks and whites, how we
Yeah.
interact with one another, the experiences we all have um, from both groups. They're quite different. How we treat each other is something I sometimes frown upon. Um, what do you make of the statement, a black man can never be racist? And if you look at the white community, a number of things, a number of attacks go to white people in South Africa. I could make a gazillion examples.
Sure.
I often wonder how that affects the white community, as far as their mental health is concerned.
Okay, that's a really profound question. And if I look at my Facebook group, when I look at my social group, the representation of the ethnicity of my friendship group is kind of in line with the demographics of the country. So around 85% of my friends are Black African, where maybe 6-7% are white European, many from South Asia, some from the US, different parts of the world. So for me, I'm very mindful, having grown up in the apartheid era. Bearing in mind I was a young child, I was preteen. That's what I knew, and I knew it didn't make sense to me because I questioned things as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old,
Mm,
and the answers by family were, well, that's the law. And for me, being neurodivergent, having ADHD, I have a strong sense of justice. So if someone says to me, gives me an answer that says, well, it's this because that's just how it is, that doesn't make sense to me if it's wrong. And so I'm fortunate to come from a family, especially on my mom's side. My dad died when I was fairly young, where we question the status quo, where we ask questions and we say, well, okay, so we're saying that because this is the law, this means that it's correct and it's morally acceptable. We challenge that. And when I say we, I mean my family, my immediate family, and I challenge it. When I
mm,
have white friends, Indian friends, Xhosa friends, Zulu friends saying you people, I'll stop and say, what do you mean by you people? Do you mean white gay male? Do you mean tall Indian woman with long black hair? What do you mean by you people? And are we stereotyping? What are we doing when we use these kinds of terms? So if we look at race and racism, racism refers to an us and them, a specific divide in terms of not only class, but a belief that one group is superior to another. So if we look at the notion of can a black man be racist, and
mm,
we look at it through the lens of, well, racism relates to one group being superior to another group, then my argument would be that a black man cannot be racist in terms of the hierarchy of where the white man, when I say white man, I talk about whites in general, have had the
mm,
upper hand for so many centuries, so many decades. But if I look at it in the 2024 context, having moved through 3 generations or 3 decades of post-apartheid, and looking at the kind of not leveling up, but the opportunities that have now opened up to more people. We're still not there yet. We're 50, 60 years away from some kind of homeostasis equilibrium in terms of not even needing to raise the element of color and culture and background because those things become irrelevant.
mm,
I think looking at it in the 2024 context, I can say taking away the um, the 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 element that racism includes superiority in terms of ranking of color, and we take that away, we can then argue that racism is applicable to any race, whether one is black, white, Indian, Asian, Chinese, South American, because we're now saying, well, because someone is a particular color or background or has certain amounts of melatonin in their skin that generate a particular skin tone, that they can call out another group of people purely based on and group them purely based on their color, rather than recognizing the individualistic component of who we are. We now start looking at the element of dignity, and we say, well, are we any less or any more dignified than they are and they were? So for me, it comes down to, in a short answer, if we strip away the dignity of another person,
mm,
then we have a problem. And so for me to go back into the 2024 context, can a black man be racist? Looking at it through the lens of equality and dignity, I believe the answer is yes. I believe we all have capacity to hate. But like Mandela said, just as we have capacity to hate, so too do we have capacity to love. And that for me is the connected thread that I see in the country, is that connectedness of love rather than an us and them narrative, because us and them doesn't do anything for anyone. And we can have us and them even within Zulu culture, different clans within the Zulu culture, us and them, which is superior, which is not. And so the moment we start to rank people socially in a social ordering, which is something that we've done since the beginning of the time, that for me is an alarm bell for promulgating and justifying an us and them scenario.
Sure. The long and short of the question that I previously asked on whether Black people can or cannot be racist is a simple no from you. Yes.
So it's, as I said, it's more complex than that. It depends on the definition of the word racism to start with. And I think if we use that as the import of the answer then comes out of that. So it's the definition of.
Yeah.
So to contextualize it, this is my opinion. It's not fact. It's an opinion. It's open to correction. It's open to learning, unlearning, and relearning, and I'm open to be challenged on it. And as we both know, I didn't suffer the negative effects of the apartheid era the way my Black African brothers and sisters did.
Yeah.
There was benefit that I had growing up, whether I admit to it or not. So these are the realities of the world that we live in. To bury my head and say, well, I never saw racism. I was always anti it growing up. It kind of carries no weight for me, in that there was benefit and there was inequality. And is there inequality today? There certainly is. The
Yeah.
inequality now is just skewed along the lines of those who have and those who have not.
Yeah.
And rather than along the race lines. And maybe the race lines, maybe there's still that inequality along the race lines, but I see it very much now in terms of the haves and the have-nots. So to answer your question very briefly, if we look at it in the context of superiority and classism, in terms of class based on color, then a Black man, given the racist structure of class, where white or Chinese is seen as the number one, numero uno, and white man at the top, and as we start to go down the line, then one would argue that it would be impossible for a Black man, in terms of the perception of that narrative, that structure, to be racist. But if we looked at it through the lens of 2024, where we have had the opportunity for equality for 3 decades, where we have equal opportunity in the country, where we have healthy integration in many levels of society, which I see. And I suppose I see it through the lens of academia, working in the academic space. I see it in the corporate space. I see it in the government space, in areas, in NGOs where multiculturalism is the order of the day. It's part and parcel of who we are. And also being someone who has traveled to more than 50 countries in the world, I see integration a lot more. It's a lot more obvious to me. And we measure people based on behavior and values rather than color. So under that guise, I can argue then that racism is doable and possible as a Black man to be racist. So the answer is depending on what the import of the racism term or word means. And when we use that, when we decide on the meaning of that word, we can then make a decision and answer based on that meaning.
Okay.
So it's tied to the meaning of the word initially, and we go from there. Yeah.
Thanks for that. earlier you mentioned a term, emotional regulation. I
Right.
want to ask, what is emotional regulation and how do we regulate our emotions?
It's a really, really good question. So for me, it starts with what is called the biopsychosocial model, which is a medical model. So it's the
Mm,
biology of the human body. It's the how we regulate our body, our mind, our muscles, our movement, the psychology, our mental health, how we see things, our perception, and the social, our group, our social group, who makes our social group? Where do we fit into that social structure? So if we look at emotional regulation is highly personalized.
mm,
So yes, we can suppress an emotion. So someone can trigger us and in a way or trigger part of us or be disparaging towards our family, our clan, our culture, strip away our dignity. And I think when that happens, that's when we have the opportunity to become emotionally regulated.
yeah.
And we've heard the new term gaslighting. So gaslighting, we have this notion of what gaslighting is. Many people that who describe gaslighting to me don't give me it like an accurate term, like a from a psychology perspective. It's essentially where your views, where you have a perception of something and you've shared that, and someone comes back and says, "Oh, but you said this, but you never said that, and you never meant that." So they start to force you to question your own sanity and reasoning around what you said and the meaning of what you said. That's gaslighting. So emotionally regulated people are able to see through that gaslighting. They're able to see through their own value system and be able to enter into a space where there is disagreement of opinion, where there's
Mm,
agreement of opinion, where there are different viewpoints, different mindsets, but they are still able to live and work in harmony with another person. So it could be a debate as simple as pro-abortion versus anti-abortion.
mm,
And one can say, well, okay, as a dysregulated, emotionally regulated individual, because a person is anti-abortion and I'm pro-abortion, I'm therefore anti them. I can then write them off. That is an immature response to using our emotions.
mm,
Emotional regulation says, okay, I hear you. I don't agree with you, your viewpoints, but I do recognize that you have a right to those views.
mm.
And your your viewpoints, while I hear them and don't agree with them, they don't trigger me, and they don't
Yes.
trigger me in an unhealthy way. So there's an importance there. So the emotional dysregulation is where those around us or the environment trigger us in a way that results in a negative outcome for us. It's the lashing out, it's the smacking someone across the face, it's the grabbing the beer bottle and hitting them. It's saying, "Oh, so you said my mama is ABC and having a hernia," or they drink in excess and say, "I drink because of you. When you stop doing this, I will stop drinking." And then I'll be like, wow, you've given me a lot of power. So these are people who are emotionally dysregulated. They hand over their power to others in the environment and they blame the external. They don't own anything. So anything that goes wrong around them is either related to luck, this person's luckier than me, or this person's corrupt, that's why they've got where they are. And they see things from a position of bitterness as
Mm,
opposed to seeing another person's growth, praising them and realizing that they too have capacity for that growth. So there's a difference. So the dysregulation relative to regulation comes down in a nutshell to the maturity and the wisdom of the person. So as we start to develop insight, that is learning about ourselves, we spoke about shadow work earlier, integrating those parts that were suppressed. Once we start to reintegrate them into who we are, we become more emotionally stable and more emotionally regulated. This is a healthy human being. This is someone who can enter into a debate with someone with completely contrasting views to them, but still maintain friendship and decorum, because they're debating the topic, not the person. They're attacking the premise of the argument rather than the individual as a person. Because when we start to attack the person, we then have what is called the straw man syndrome. We start attacking the person, whereas actually the individual was talking about a subject or a collective of subjects or a theme or a narrative. We now move that because we can't argue them. We can't argue their conversation. We move into arguing them as a person. And that's when we've lost. That's the emotional dysregulation. So we've, and the thing is, as mature as we get and as wise as we get, we are always in a state of growth. So even psychologists, even psychiatrists who've been in private practice, working professionally for 20, 30, 40 years, can have moments of dysregulation. Dysregulation is not limited to those that lack insight. It's available to all of us. And it also depends on our level of vulnerability at that time. We could be compromised. We could be really ill in terms of flu virus. We could have been in a car accident. We could be in a state of grief. Our immune system could be down. Our defenses could be down. We're therefore emotionally dysregulated, and we need that kindness. So for me, as part of closing our conversation within the podcast, it's important to remember that we all have a perception to the world. It can be negative, neutral, or positive. And I think we need to be mindful that if we hand over our power and are triggered by every single emotional event that comes our way, we lose our power and we lose ourselves in that. And that's not healthy. And this is what keeps psychologists and psychiatrists really busy and making money. It's by getting people to manage those triggers where they say, how do I get my partner to stop triggering me? Wrong question. Question should be, how do I work on my triggers? How do I work on my emotional regulation? And that's practice. And that's a movement from a state of reacting to the environment, which is you say something to me and I come back with a reaction, which is generally negative and counterproductive, or I pause, reflect, and respond. The response is emotionally regulated. The reaction is generally dysregulated. So we've got to move from reaction to response. And that can be that can be a topic for an entirely new or different podcast in discussing how to work on that, because there are techniques that we can use to work on that and work on self.
I mean, I would love to have a lengthy discussion on that. Maybe we should consider having another session outside of this. Maybe in the next coming seasons, you can expand more on that, because it really is something that needs to be spoken about at length. I think many of us are just struggling with, I'll refer to it as a mental health thing. We are struggling with mental illnesses. And the more we have these conversations, the more I believe that we are going to get the assistance we need. Some people can't afford services out there as they relate to mental health issues. So I think it would be an opportune moment to have you speak about those on this platform. But maybe before I let you go, I was thinking as you were talking just now about individuals that are passive aggressive. Is that some form of emotional dysregulation as well?
We could say it falls in the realm of that. It's that they have got issues relating to boundaries. They've got issues relating to directness in communication. So they'd rather be indirect in punching and criticizing those around them than being direct. And we seem to live in a society where saying things as they are, as we see them, is seen as a negative. It should be seen as a positive, because when we're passive aggressive, we are. It's, for me, there's a sense of immaturity in the passive aggressiveness, because we're not being clear. There's no clarity in our communication style, and that can be misinterpreted. So for me, from a psychological perspective, I try to work within the framework of positive psychology. There's a term called clean language, which is another discussion we can have. So clean language is being very clear and deliberate about what we say and what we mean. So one example, well, I'm not going to give any examples now. We're going to go over time. But the passive aggressiveness does creep in when we feel that we're in a state of disempowerment with the person. So all we can do is act passive aggressively. And but we've got to be mindful of that. And passive aggressiveness isn't something that we just grow out of and we turn 30 and bam, it's gone. There are times that we have to bite our tongue, certainly in hierarchical situations like academia, where we are squashed and minimized due to our rank rather than our intellect. And so the only way that we can show and gain some kind of autonomy in the situation is to be passively aggressive. But that passive aggressiveness generally leads to negative outcomes. So for me, I use a term called sandwiching. So it's not because I'm not using the word sandwich because my stomach needs food right now, which it generally always does. But what I try and do when I want to persuade someone or influence them into a direction that I'm looking at or see things from my perspective, I'll put a negative followed by a positive, followed by a negative. So I'll say, as an example, the culture of the organization leaves me feeling like I'm being bullied. And I feel like my ability to grow is being stifled here. Having said that, the individuals I work with, so now we go on to the positive, the individuals I work with are warm, compassionate, kind. I can see that they want growth. I can see that they want change. They may not know how to create that change. So you then sandwich it with a positive and say that I believe the skills of the individuals in the team are sufficient for us to grow and develop. And then we end by saying, should we not grow and develop, we're going to end up with disintegration within the group. And this is as a result of us being rigid rather than having a growth mindset. So what we're doing is we're sandwiching negative, positive, negative together. So we're giving the positive is almost the balance between the two negatives. Because I've been in many board meetings where I've been on many boards and trusts over the years, and as an advisor and as a member, and I find the manager speaks and it's kind of top-down approach, and you got to just listen, and I think that kills creativity. And I think if we allow people space to talk, to share, to give their critiques of what's happening in the organization, that's very healthy. But as I say to any staff member who's worked with me, if you are going to criticize what I do or the methodology of what the business does, at least come to me with an alternative. So it's easy to say one thing like, this building looks really horrible. The color's horrible. And they'll be like, okay, so now what, Q? You'll be like, no, that's all. It's just horrible and it's badly laid out. And they'll say, well, what ideas do you have to change it? And you say, I don't know. I'm just telling you that it doesn't look good. So you're criticizing, but you're not adding value. So for me, from a pro-social perspective, if I'm going to influence, I'm going to say, okay, this building, it can work. The current layout isn't ergonomically set for what we need. If we move the toilets here, and if we open that wall and do this and do this and do this, we can now start to create a flow through for the building. So I'm using that as an example. And so what I'm now doing is I'm using a solution-based approach to solving a current conundrum that I'm seeing that isn't working. So the policies may be there that don't work, and we can criticize the policies, but unless we have an alternative in place, we may as well not even speak. And we see this in politics. All we hear is political parties criticize the other parties. They don't say, we have achieved the following, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can expand this in the following way. It's always tit for tat. This one did this one did that. There's nothing productive in it. So you end up with mud flinging and slinging, and everyone gets covered in mud, as opposed to saying, you know what, the previous government or the current government, these elements work. Let's use that as a foundation to get the other things working. So you start becoming proactive in acknowledging the strengths rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So you acknowledge the strengths and you acknowledge the good work that's being done with the limited financial resources, but you also say, well, these elements of the organization or unit or team or government are not working because money is being spent fruitlessly. If money were redirected in these channels, we could then integrate and add to what is already working. So it's the approach. You then start to change the approach from passive aggressive to one of solution focused, proactive, and it's far healthier. And it's you have a higher probability of persuasion and influence. And that, tying back to our need and our respect of the elders, where the elders talk down at us, if we start to shift that, so it's not top down, but rather two parties at different age bands together communicating, one receiving wisdom from the other, but also the elders realizing that they too can learn from the younger generation. I mean, I know the older generation will come to me and say, Gareth, I've been given this phone by my grandchild. I don't know how to use it. So what do I say? But you're the elder, you're the wise one, you should know it. They don't. So I come along then and help them set up their phone and get it working. So it's a two-way street. It's not one direction. It's multi-directional. And when we take away that hierarchical nature and connect at the humanistic level, we start to drive society forward in a healthy way.
Thanks for that. I promise last question. And I'm going to ask this one because it sort of is stuck in my head. It relates directly to me. I had a very lengthy discussion last night, with a friend of mine who is in Bloemfontein. And as we were talking, he said to me, Q, you are not in touch with your emotions. And what he then said was, it's easy for you to compliment a person, but in your complimenting somebody, it borders on emotionlessness. You are acknowledging that, okay, Gareth is dressed nicely, but it's just a by the way thing, and then you talk about something else. That's one of the examples he made. And then he says, in some instances, whenever I engage you or listen to you talking about love matters, it seems to me like you are somewhat cold. Yes, you acknowledge you love a person, but you need to stretch. You need to be expressive. You don't do those things. They lack. So how does one get in touch with their emotions if there is such a lag?
Wow.
Yeah, carry on.
That's a powerful question. So I want to answer it in the context of Myers-Briggs. So Myers-Briggs is a team of psychologists from many years ago, I think 50s, 60s, who developed the 16 personality factor. So it's four components, four different letters, each standing for certain things. And you spoke about feeling. So the third leg of the four letters acronym that comes out of the assessment. So we're one of 16 personality groups, and these are dominant. They're kind of stable through our life. Okay. So what we're looking at is in the context of Myers-Briggs is the third element. So you spoke about feeling, thinking, and the third one is sensing. Was actually yeah. So there's the two. It's thinking and feeling. My apologies. Thinking and feeling. We can be thinkers and feelers at the same time, but one may be more dominant than the other in our natural personality style. So it's another thing. We live in a world of where extroverts are praised relative to introverts. So we're taught from a young age to be extroverted, but many academics, many intellectuals are introverted. So how do we take an introvert and make them extroverted? We're kind of pushing a square peg into a round hole, and we're kind of minimizing their natural behaviors and natural who they are. So the fact that you are a thinker versus a feeler doesn't mean that you lack feeling. That's fallacious. It's a nonsense statement. It's you can have both. It's that the one is more dominant than the other. So you are logical by nature. So for you to solve problems, you strip the feeling out and you go straight to the detail as a scientist of the thinking side. We need that. At the same time, the world also needs the healers. It needs those who are the feelers, the empaths, the ones who can feel the emotion linked to the event, linked to the family, linked to society. So it's not one is superior to the other, or, well, you're a thinker, therefore you should become a feeler. It's about the world needs all of us. There's space for all of us. And I think when we realize that we're not carbon copies of each other, and that we are our own unique individual, and that we have dignity and that we give dignity, and we know what our strengths and weaknesses are, we then can embrace those parts of ourselves and say, you know what, you're right, I am a thinker, but it's really awesome that you, as my friend who is a feeler, give me balance in how I see things. So you start to draw the strength out of the relationship of the two of you together. Because if both of you or everyone you were surrounded with were the same as you identically in terms of how you think, your chance and probability of growth is far less than being surrounded by people who stretch your mind and get you to think in ways that you hadn't thought of before. And that's why it's so healthy to have the opportunity to travel outside of our community and to meet other communities and to see their perceptions of things in terms of how they do things, why they do things in certain ways. So the thinking versus feeling, it's not one is superior to another. That's not the answer I would give, or the leaning I would give. I would say is we need to embrace all the components that make up who we are. And how we identify who we are is through insight, asking ourselves, what is it that I stand for? What are my values? If I don't stand for anything, I fall. If I've got no values, I can fall for anything. So I know who I am. Yes, I am introverted. And for me, I always had this notion I was extroverted. And I was doing my master's degree, and we were doing this program on the big 5 personality types, including one of them is extroversion. So whether you're extroverted, introverted. And I did the assessment. It's all science-based, and I came up as a complete introvert. And I said, this is nonsense. And I chatted to my prof and I said, this is wrong. I'm an extrovert. And she said, yeah. She said, but how do you recharge your batteries? And I said, well, what do you mean? She's like, when you are tired after being with people, do you go to a party and recharge? Do you go to a coffee shop with 10 friends and recharge? Or what? And I say, oh my God, no. I go home, I read a book, close the curtains, listen to a podcast. I'm on my own. And she said, well, that's the introvert. You recharge on your own. So the
Mm,
thinker versus feeler doesn't mean that your thinking dominates your feeling.
mm,
That's not correct. You do feel. However, in following solutions and finding solutions for problems, new solutions, you err on the side of thinking and evidence rather
mm,
than the gut feel that your friend has. And both
mm,
are relevant in healthy decision makings. So from a diversity perspective, when we talk about creating diverse and equitable and inclusive environments, we're not talking about skin color. We're not talking about male versus female. We're talking
mm,
about diversity of perception of how we see the world, how we solve problems.
mm,
Because when we can broaden that and bring in more people with different perceptions and perspectives, we have a higher probability then of creating solutions that are workable for all.
mm,
And so that's kind of where I want to end on that, versus with the thinking versus the feeling side of things within the scope of Myers-Briggs.
mm. But then, what you just described now, I think it is, if you look at it from a work context, such a Q is a phenomenal person. But if you look at it from a relationship perspective, whether with family, an intimate partner, etc., do you think it's still a healthy way of functioning, if I may? I don't have the right term there.
Yes, I think so. And I think, with any relationship, there's overlap in terms of values. So you and your partner, one could be a feeler, one could be a thinker. You
Mm,
could still share overlapping values in terms of trust, honesty, charity, compassion, humility. These can be overarching and overlapping values. One
mm,
can still be a thinker and one can still be a feeler.
yeah.
As I said, it's not superior. One is not superior to the other. They're complementary. We need both. We Do we need extroverts? Yes, we do. Do we need introverts? 100%. Do we need ambiverts, people who are both extroverted and extroverted? Yes, we do. The world has space for everyone. And what happens is that we end up with a society where people don't do enough self-work, insight into who they are. And they then become molded and malleable by society. They then become what society wants them to be. So
Mm,
I meet a lot of chartered accountants who say, I hate accounting, but my dad was a chartered accountant and I was kind of pushed into this direction. So I say, well, what did you want to do? And they'll be like, I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to paint. So, I mean, it's quite different to being a chartered accountant. I mean, so we then look at it and say, okay, well, is painting available for you in your part-time as a hobby so that you still have the opportunity to embrace those parts of yourself that were suppressed in your younger years, that shadow work from Jung that we were talking about earlier, and start to integrate them into who you are today. But it
mm,
comes down to insight. And insight, it sounds easy to do, but it takes a huge amount of effort, direction, and also deliberate intention to
mm,
develop that insight. So to go back to your question about a partnership of a thinker and a feeler, absolutely. Two thinkers can make a good relationship. Two feelers can make a good relationship. A thinker and a feeler can make a good relationship. For
mm,
me, what ties down the whether the relationship will work or not is the values. Is there a values overlap
mm,
between the two? And if there is, then there's potential for a relationship.
mm,
Do they give each other space to grow? or is one in the shadow of the other? Because if one is in the shadow of the other, and that other one is intimidated by the growth of their spouse, then you end up with a recipe for disaster, probably divorce.
Mm.
When you have a relationship where both parties support each other's growth and are not jealous of each other, and support and encourage and praise and develop and uplift, you then have the relationships that stand the test of time.
Mm.
And that comes down to not being passive aggressive, but being direct, open, saying things like, when you say this, I feel hurt. I feel betrayed. I feel as though my trust has been broken. So you
Mm.
now start to bring the feeling in. And this is something that as thinkers, we can do this. We can do this too. We can use these feeling words back to emotion. So we own the feeling. So rather than saying, you make me feel like a piece of rubbish, you say, I feel like a piece of rubbish when you speak to me in that way. So
Mm.
you're now taking ownership of your feelings, which is a result of what they've said to you. So
Mm.
it's turning it around, but it's a very subtle shift in a way that allows you to take ownership of
Mm.
your feelings. And it's difficult. And you know, we've got a lot of collective trauma in the country stemming back pre-apartheid. That trauma is not going to go away in one hit. This is generational trauma. What we can do though is we can be deliberate about being kind, using Ubuntu. Looking back, let's look at Ubuntu. We could even do a session on Ubuntu and actually look at Ubuntu, at the import of Ubuntu. What does it mean? You know,
Mm.
and because of others. What does that mean? I mean, like, okay, so I am because of others. I don't know what that means. We can delve into that and, and expand on it, explore it, and see where our triggers are. Why we get angry when we see someone coming into our rural homestead in a fancy car, and we're saying, but who do they think they are coming here showing their fancy car or coming in and building mom and dad a bigger house? They just think that they're superior to us. What do we want? Do we want to all stay minimal? Do we want to stay small? Or do we want to embrace growth? Do we want to embrace people who are trying to do better for themselves, for their family, for their community? So it's where does it come from? So we've got to look at that. So that's where the introspection comes from. It's a
Mm.
lot of hard work.
Yeah. Great thought. Thank you very much. Thank you for your wisdom. I enjoyed this conversation. I wish we had more time,
Me
but you
too.
still owe me two conversations, second one being Ubuntu now.
There we go.
That's
And
it. I'm
it's
not
been a
going to
pleasure.
say, I'm not going to say goodbye. This isn't a full stop. We put in a comma. I'm going to see you in this platform again.
I
Thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much.
Thank you. And Q, by the way, if any of your listeners and viewers have any criticisms or critiques of what I've shared, I would love them to share it with you. And because like them, I'm a work in progress too. So I'm here to learn too. So there are blind spots in what I say and what I see, and I acknowledge that. So I embrace the criticism and the critiques. It's fine. If it can improve me and those around me, I'm game for it. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you very much, Q. All the best to you.